Theresa, how old was Daniel when you first realized something was amiss?
Daniel was 11. He was 11 when he was diagnosed.
Oh, was your mic on?
Is my mic on? I guess not. Daniel was
there you are.
Daniel was 11 years old when he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma. And it was between the time we noticed symptoms and the time he was diagnosed was very short.
You've described him as a athletic, funny, dynamic guy. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Dan had a smile that would light up a room. He loved to smile. Everybody liked him. I mean, the boys liked him, the girls liked him. He liked to play. He was the captain of his basketball team. He had a black belt in karate. And the kids on the street all played with him, and everybody liked him. Even his teachers, academically, his record was improvable. But
too smart.
he just had a smile that would light up a room, and he would never give up. He just smiled.
Now, for folks who don't know your background, you are, as someone said, she's actually a rocket scientist. You've helped program missions for NASA and satellites. So when you first heard of Daniel's diagnosis, what was your first instinct as a mom? And then what was your instinct as a scientist?
So as a parent, as a mom, it's devastating to have a child, to be told your child has cancer. It totally changes everything that you think life is about. So it was devastating, and then they put in front of you this protocol. They say, we're going to do this, 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 and this, and we're going to operate like this, and we're going to do this, and you kind of go along, and at a certain point when I started coming out of this like fog of being like, oh my word, my child has cancer, I started doing research. And that's when I realized that the outcomes for osteosarcoma are pretty poor overall.
But your version of doing research is different than the average layperson's of doing research. Dr. Kaplan, I'm going to let you actually answer that question for me with the way you're nodding. Explain to our folks the kind of research that Theresa started to do.
Right, so many families are found in the situation that Theresa was in, feel very lost and look for answers from doctors, friends, the internet often. And I think, I'm sure Theresa, along with others, did that as well. But her background, I think, led her to look deeper at understanding osteosarcoma, I think, when she started to realize that there was a lot to be learned about that. And I think that's true of many pediatric cancers and cancer in general. Not for lack of really smart people trying and understanding, but it's a complicated disease, and it needs a lot of good minds. And I think that the interesting thing about Theresa is that she used her background and experience to understand a problem in a new way, and that always, I think, brings out some very new and exciting possibilities when you do that. So that's how she approached it.
What skill sets did you apply to your research? And then let us know a little bit where it led you.
Okay. So I'm a space mission design engineer, so that means I do the design of satellite networks and the ground systems. So I do a lot of what's called systems engineering, where I try to understand the whole system, understand the vulnerabilities, understand what are the weak points, the strong points, how to improve the design. And I do a lot of statistical analysis and data mining in support of this from a space mission perspective. And so what I did, I essentially taught myself genomics, and then started looking, because all of the parents, there are these online groups of parents, and they started passing me the data and the genomic data and the medical history data of their kids. And I just started aggregating it, and it got bigger and bigger, and I was able to I started looking at it, trying to understand, well, what is it that drives osteosarcoma? Like, what's the gene behind osteosarcoma, or the genes, whatever it might be? And I mean, keep in mind, at the time I was teaching myself genomics, so I was asking some pretty dumb questions, really. And then I
Basic questions.
Basic.
Basic.
All right, we'll go with basic. It sounds better. And I started running statistical analyses and trying to understand how everything fit together. And I was able to identify, by doing a multivariate regression analysis, which is a type of statistical analysis of big data, I was able to identify different genomic subtypes. And then one night, a few months after Dan died, I just had this thought, which was, okay, so in the satellite world, you think of networks and you analyze satellite systems as a network. And I thought, well, everybody in cancer talks about pathways, the cell signaling pathways. Well, what if instead of a pathway, it's a network inside a cancer cell? Could I figure out a way to do a traffic analysis, which is something we do in the satellite communications world, and could I do that in an osteosarcoma cell? And so, keep in mind this was 1 in the morning, and I was grieving and depressed and had insomnia. And I just thought, well, I'll do it. What the heck? And so I did, and one of the things that came up, and I kind of invented some stuff, but I was doing the analysis, and I realized there was one gene that kept showing up in this, which in the satellite communications world would say that's a choke point, which is a vulnerability, which if you want to destroy a network, you go for the choke point. You do not go for the obvious big shiny ball that says, come hit me. You look for the one that you can't see. And this gene ROC1 kept showing up, and I thought, well, maybe it's a choke point. Maybe there would be something, and then I used Google, our friend Google, to find out if there was a drug that would target ROC1. Because my theory was that it would be overexpressed in osteosarcoma based upon the mathematical modeling that I did. And it turns out that there's a pretty old drug related to something, I mean, Rosie, you're a doc, it's like heart disease or stroke or something totally not cancer related, which targets this.
So Dr. Kaplan, tell people where your work was before you met Theresa, and then how the two of you came together.
Yes. So my work is actually focused on metastasis. That's my primary interest, because many patients that are diagnosed even with localized disease can go on to develop metastasis. And unfortunately, our therapies are not as effective as we'd like in the metastatic setting, and patients often progress and have poor outcomes when they have metastatic disease. My lab in particular, the aspect of metastasis that we're interested in is the process of it happening. So many people are interested in the process of tumor formation, and that's super important, but it's sort of, for me, like a car accident that already happened, because my patients come and they come with their imaging and they have their bone or soft tissue mass already there. And it's not that it's not important to know what caused it, it's super important, but I'm dealing with the now and those patients, and that window of time before they become metastatic, or if they become metastatic, some patients are even diagnosed with metastasis, but then will develop further metastasis, is a process. And I am looking at that process. And that process involves not only the tumor cells themselves. When we talk about a tumor, it's actually a symphony. We have the tumor cells, and then all the other players in the symphony, flute, violin, cello, and those are all your host cells, your own cells that are working with the tumor in one way or another, and that's what forms that big mass. So the analysis that Theresa did was on the tumor cells, and we studied that and their interaction with these other cells called microenvironment cells, your cells that are normally in your tissue. And that process is very important in metastatic spread, because your tumor is going from one site to another, and new microenvironment cells have to interact well. And so we're very interested in that crosstalk and how that forms and how that process happens. And I think it's quite interesting, the parallels that came up because of what she found and what we were already working on.
Theresa, once you had this information, how did you share it with the medical community and the research community, and how were you received initially? That's the answer.
So how did I share it? So first I sent it out to Dan's docs. I sent it out to the various docs who'd consulted. And then frankly, I just started calling people up and sending out. I put together a presentation, sort of a summary of it, and I just started calling docs up and said, here, this is what I found. And I have, 80 tumor, I have an analysis based on 80 tumors and medical histories, or I have 100 and et cetera. And initially the response was, yes, 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 you're a grieving mother, we understand. And it went into the bottom drawer, essentially. Because I am not a medical professional, I'm not a biologist, I do not have anything, and I am a grieving mother. Eventually, there were several docs who started listening, who started looking at it. Rosie was one of the first. And we're like, wait a minute, there might be something here. You have more data on osteosarcoma genomics and medical history than anybody else. So what can we learn from this? And so now I think now I'm more well received, but I'm not a doc, and that's a, let's just leave it at that. It's been an interesting experience.
Well, how many trials or how many research projects are happening because of your work?
There's several.
Yeah.
There's, I mean, in part what Rosie's doing. There's a clinical trial which is in the planning stages, because the idea that there are subtypes of osteosarcoma, genomic subtypes, which lend themselves to being treated differently and to having different responses to therapy, you know, that your next step is, well, then if they're different and they respond differently to therapy, then maybe we should be treating them differently, and how do we do that? And there's a doc out at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, who's been working on that, and he's been doing it in the mice, and so there's a collaboration there going on to put that into, try to put that into a clinical trial, a combination clinical trial based, you know, genomically subtyping the kids. Those are the big ones. There's another initiative right now that's just in the planning stages related to a sort of whole exome sequencing of osteosarcoma kids. But that's also, I mean, that's coming off of my work, but it's in the early planning stages yet.
You know, as we were talking about this and researching this subject, the idea came up, the discussion came up, and I'm very curious from you, Dr. Kaplan, of the idea of targeted research versus curiosity-driven research. And some people think we're in an imbalance, that we don't do enough curiosity research, which is essentially what you started doing. What are your thoughts on that? And why are we in imbalance, and the pros and cons of each?
Right. It's a fascinating question, and it comes up a lot. So most work, and really most success that's happened, is iterative, meaning baby steps over time. I think most people don't want to hear that because they want to know the big, amazing splash that happened. But to be perfectly honest, there's a humbling, beautiful thing about tweaking something and getting it just right. And I think we're doing that now with many things. Theresa's work, I think, aside from how it was received by the medical community, was very well timed, because there is a tremendous interest now in taking big data and analyzing it in new ways, similar to the way that Theresa's been thinking about it. She was in good company, because MIT is, a whole group at the Broad Institute at MIT is actively doing this. And I think people are much more open to the idea that your genomic subtype is very important, dictating the whole process, but it also is interacting with your immune system and your stromal cells and that interaction. So I think most of the discoveries we make are iterative. That all being said, most of the exciting things that I'm doing in lab is taking my knowledge of what's iteratively going on stepwise in the field, which is important, and which is why she spent so much time trying to understand what's actually happening in the field now to know. And then taking the moments of good ideas or data that shows something interesting or different and moving with that. And that's kind of the curiosity that has to happen. And it drives our new therapies a lot of the time, because not because someone wasn't doing good science in their own field, but sometimes it becomes relatable to a different field, and that's really magical. I think being a scientist is knowing when to take those moments of good ideas wherever they come from, and have it dovetail. And in particular with ROC1, for example, it's really important in the microenvironment cells. And she wasn't thinking about it in that way, but I was thinking about it in that way, and that's how good ideas come together. So not only can we target the ROC1 in the osteosarcoma cells, but osteosarcoma cells are bone cells that interact with stromal cells in the bone, and those cells respond to ROC1 as well. So if we can have a 1-2 punch that we're targeting both aspects, it's really exciting. So I think there is a bit of both that happens all the time, and I think by having the discussion, we keep that balance hopefully in check, and that's how we make real progress.
So you're for the combination of the two?
I really am.
We're going to take questions in just one moment, so if the mics want to go out to the audience. Theresa, you mentioned, I just got all this information about, can you explain to us how you amassed all this information, and also a little bit about what other parents told you, because people also gave you information.
Yeah, I mean, all of the data I've gotten from parents. And so, I mean, there's online forums and online listservs and emails, and there's these various online communities of parents. So many of the osteosarcoma kids relapse, and there's no treatment for relapse. There's no effective treatment for relapse. The parents are desperate, and so I had put out some information, and so parents just started sending me. They said, well, if I send you my kids, can you take a look at it? And you know, and then I would say, well, what kind of medical history? Because it's it's a genomic report. It's just a snapshot in time, and there's no. And so then I started getting multiple snapshots from kids who would relapse multiple times to see what would happen, sometimes before therapy or after therapy, a relapse in a clinical trial, for example. And it just sort of grew organically. There wasn't. I had no plan. My plan was to try to save my son's life. That was my plan. That failed, but I just realized there's all these other kids and there's all these other parents, and they are equally desperate. And so it just sort of grew and grew and grew. And then parents, it was the kind of thing of word of mouth. Parents would say, "Oh, your kid relapsed. Go talk to Theresa and give her the genomic report, and she'll give you an analysis of it." And so that's what I do. It's just all.
That's so interesting. You became a beacon for a lot of people, I'm sure.
I mean,
yes.
For sure.
Yeah.
And good ideas spread. And so that's always an exciting part of it too, I think, that you start with this interesting, many people want to understand in the cancer community how cells and tumors change in response to therapies. But if she has some analogy, even anecdotes sometimes build enthusiasm, and then researchers think, yeah, we're on the right track, and then more people are talking. And I have to say, things that come up, deeper sequencing is getting very exciting, and that's kind of like the tipping the scale in that way with having this big data. But I do think having a personal understanding of it and seeing it firsthand, what it means, I think motivates people even more. And both researchers and parents alike can have that kind of collaborative interaction. We've both been at a meeting recently that involved the scientists talking about their science and docs and family members there together. And at first blush, you tell the scientists or doctors about this, they think, oh, that's interesting. But it's an amazing opportunity to have that dialogue. And I always say the parents are the expert on that patient. They are the expert, and they will give you so much information. So if we can work together in those ways, I think it grows.
Do you have any questions from anyone for the doctor or for Theresa? No? I can keep going. I got a ton. Theresa, I want you to tell folks who are in the audience and watching online the name, the slug line of the name of your organization and the slug line for it.
It's because of Daniel, and it's because of my son Daniel. Mm-hmm. And it's punching osteosarcoma in the face is the tagline. Because when Dan was in chemotherapy, that's what he would say. He'd be like, I'm going to punch the osteosarcoma in the face. And my daughter was the one who picked that. And she and Dan were very close, and she was like, this was Dan.
I wanted people to know that, because I think it's sort of a part about your energy and about the energy behind this.
Yeah, I mean,
fighting in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible disease, and I would not wish this on anyone, on any family. And if I can do something to help, then I feel like I have to.
And I do want to bring up the F word, funding.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about the challenges of funding for this kind of work.
Yeah. So it's interesting we brought up the aspect that she was looking at the genomics data, because recently there's been an interest in funding more of that and sequencing, discussions of should we be sequencing every pediatric cancer and knowing more. I think it's a great idea, and I think the more funding we can get to do that, the better. I think there are a lot of opportunities out there for good science to be funded. There's never enough. It's always what it is, especially when I always find if I get grant funding, or of course I receive funding from the NCI, a project's going really well, I'm like, this is great, I have money and I can do this. But then it's like, oh, it goes so well, and you're like, uh-oh, I need more funding. That's the dread of when things go really well, that you often need more. But I think
pediatric cancer well funded? The statistics suggest it's not.
It's tough. The statistics are interesting because pediatric cancer is rare. So of course the funding is going to look a lot less than much more common cancers. But I think it could always be better funded. And I think pediatric cancer is an amazing example of why putting your funding dollars into pediatric cancer can help many different types of cancers. Not that that's the reason that you need to fund pediatric cancer, because every day we have plenty of reasons why you need to fund pediatric cancer for pediatric cancer research purposes. But cancer research in general, I think, can snowball, and the data that we learn, some of the models and the approach we have, especially to multimodal therapy, started in pediatric cancer. And it was so well accepted that it became part of the bigger community and actually helped many adult cancer models when we were doing it in pediatric cancers first. And I'm proud of that history, and I'm proud to be a pediatric cancer researcher, and I'm proud to study tough, difficult diseases that we have not been as successful at, and I hope that we're going to get more successful.
Before I let you go, is there anything I didn't ask you that you think is important, Theresa?
I know this is the part where I'm supposed to like have some great thing, but
no, just whatever is on your mind. Parting thought.
I think our kids are our future, and watching your child die from a disease like this changes your life. It completely and utterly changes everything about who you are and what you think and what you believe. And the repercussions go on for decades. They do not end when your child dies. They just start when your child dies, because it impacts the whole family, it impacts the whole community, the school, etc. And I believe that if we value anything as a society, we have to value our children, because they are the future. And so I believe that we have to choose to do something about that. And my choice has been to try to help osteosarcoma however I can, the families, and then the research. Because these kids deserve so much more.
Let's thank our guests, and thank you both for the work you've been doing.